Hello everybody, my name's Zahir and welcome to my channel Plants and Paints. So today we're going to be talking about the Monstera Deliciosa, which is this plant here. And I'm going to start off with a little introduction into the plant itself before we get into the care and maintenance of the plant. And I'm just going to mention in a few sentences how this plant is actually now starting to be considered an invasive species in some of the countries where it's been introduced to. So let's get started, okay? So the the Monstera Deliciosa is a species of flowering plant from the Araceae family and is native to the forests of southern Mexico, spreading south all the way to Panama. Now, it's been introduced to many tropical areas and has become mildly invasive species in certain places. Now, these places would include Hawaii, the Seychelles, Ascension Island, and the Society Islands. Now, due to the introduction there and the fact that in nature this plant grows to quite vast sizes, it's actually become registered as a mildly invasive species. So there are efforts being made in those places to actually reduce the population of this plant. I find that, understandable that that is the case, but at the same time, I find it quite strange that, in shops you can go to, you might only find a few of these at a time, and, online stocks are limited to them. So, I think that there's a possibility that, opportunities are being wasted where these farming companies are going to remove them, and I think they're just in effect culling them and not actually doing anything with them, where there is opportunity for those people to make an amount of money out of it, if you like. And if there is anyone out there watching who's involved in that, it would be a good idea for you to maybe keep that in mind. So in this plant's native environment, they can actually grow to vast proportions. Now, in its native environment, it has that has actually extended to the places where I've actually mentioned where it was introduced. Although natively not grown there, it does grow to the proportions that I'm going to mention within those spaces as well. So this plant can actually grow to about 60 foot in height, which is absolutely gargantuan. I mean, if you were to find one of that size, you're probably going to need to be scaling some very high trees to actually get to the top, to see the top of this plant. And as you can imagine, a 60-foot high plant, the size of the leaves on this are going to be absolutely massive as well. I mean, you're probably looking at 6 to 7 foot leaves on a plant that big. Now, that is within its native environments. You're not going to get anything within that size within your general plant keeping hobby. So once you introduce them to your home, your average growth height is anywhere between 8 to 10 foot in height, although in some pictures I've seen on the internet or on Instagram I have seen them bigger than that. But I suppose it's depending on the size of the space that you are giving the plant to allow it to grow. So on average, like my ceiling is probably about 10 to 11 foot in height away from the ground. So I would imagine the size that you get them to within the home is based on the amount of size that they have to actually grow. And you're not going to have 60-foot ceilings in your house, so obviously they're not going to get anywhere near that. So they're going to get on average 8 to 10 foot. The places where I have seen them significantly larger than that within houses is when people have put them like in the stairway, because the stairway will go up through to the second floor of the house. So you're ending up with almost 20 foot, I would imagine 20 to 25 foot in height in growing space for that plant to grow. So if you do find your plant starting to reach towards the ceiling, and you do want it to continue growing, and you do have a stairway in your house, and it extends from the floor straight up to towards the top of the house, then that might be a place for you to consider to put that plant. Now also, the leaves on the plant within your home on an 8 to 10 foot plant are actually going to get up to 3 foot in length, which again, even for a house plant, that is a huge leaf. And this plant doesn't grow up in a straight line, it sort of spreads off in different directions. So you've not only got the height to contend with, you've got the width of the plant as well. So it is a plant that demands quite a lot of space. I mean, in the time that I've had this plant, in the space that I require it to be living, I have had to actually trim a few of the side leaves off because they're pointing off in directions where it's interfering with space that I want to use for other plants. And also, it was popping off in 2 to 3 different directions. So I was actually taking cuttings off it and giving those cuttings to other people. But I have since then managed to keep it in, the form that I want it to grow in, which has been pretty handy for me because I do like having this in the house and I do want it to grow to a big proportion. But I think what I'm going to have to do is constantly, every few months be training the plant. So I think I've given a good enough general introduction into the plant there. So we're going to actually move on to the care and maintenance now. So what we're going to do first is we're going to talk about lighting. I think the reason generally I put lighting first is because when you come home after purchasing a new plant, the first thing you're going to think about isn't, watering um, parameters that you're going to set for it or something. You're going to put the plant down and you're going to think, is this plant getting enough light here? So I think adequately we'll talk about lighting first. So the Monstera itself has very low lighting requirements, so can be grown in a range of lighting conditions. You can actually place this plant in a low lighting condition, and this can be particularly helpful if you want to adopt a slow growth pattern for your plant, as it will eventually reach mammoth proportions anyway. So if you want to slow that down, then it would be a good idea to actually put it in a low lighting condition, although that will have an effect on the size of the leaves that the plant produces, and the growth pattern that it actually grows in. So that's not to say that eventually you're not going to end up with big leaves anyway. All it is it's going to slow the process of that down for you. However, if you're the kind of person who's going for the larger and more dramatic growth and the more dramatic leaf patterns in the plant, and you want to achieve that at an earlier stage rather than a later stage, then it would be suggested that you give the plant bright lighting conditions. However, that being said, try to avoid strong direct light, as this can burn the leaves on the plant. So you want to still keep it indirect as far as the lighting is concerned, but you can have it a lot closer to the light, so it is getting that bright indirect light. I mean, myself, I'm quite fortunate where I live. I've got a north facing window in my living room. I know I mention this in pretty much every video, but even though I've got a north facing window, I do get an adequate amount of light in here. I mean, as you can probably see from behind me, all my plants, they look very happy. I've grouped them all together yesterday just because our weather started to change, and I want to keep them happy as winter starts approaching. So obviously keeping them together helps to do that. So lighting, as far as providing filtered light. Now, obviously not everybody's got a north facing window and their light doesn't react the same way mine does to my plant. So just as an example, putting it in a south facing window directly in front of the window is an example where you're giving it direct light, and that will actually burn the leaves of the plant. So you can actually create filtered light in that environment as well. And what you can do is, I'm sure most of you have this at home anyway, but your net curtains, so if you draw the net curtains over your south facing window, you'll still get a lot of light in, because south facing windows are directly in line with the sun coming in, so you're going to get the sun rays actually entering the house. And if you draw the net curtains, it will actually filter that light for you, so you're not going to get that direct sunlight coming in. It's going to be filtered through those net curtains, and it will be filtered enough for it not to burn the leaves on the plant. So there are ways around. If you do have a south facing window in your home, don't be discouraged because it is in direct sunlight. There are ways that you can work around that. Okay, so I think I've talked pretty much in enough detail about lighting there. So what we're going to do is we're going to move on to potting mix. Now, this plant in general, I would suggest is good for all levels of plant keeper, and it's a very forgiving plant. So, all the way from beginner to expert, if you're new to plant keeping and you were considering having this plant in your collection and you don't already have one, then I would suggest it's a perfect plant to start off with. They are so hardy and they are so forgiving, and the parameters in which you get to keep them are so vast that I find it difficult to suggest how you can actually go wrong with this plant. It's a very, very easy plant to keep. So as far as the potting mix is concerned, you can just use a standard good quality potting mix with the addition of some peat moss in there. Now, when I actually received this Monstera initially, it was probably about this big when I received it. It's probably about 3.5 foot tall now. I've had it for the best part of a year. When I first got the plant, I did actually, like I mentioned earlier, have it in a very low light condition because I did want to stagger its growth. I didn't want it getting to huge proportions in a short period of time because I was still collecting plants at that time and wasn't quite sure exactly where I wanted to house it. But since spring kicked in, I did actually move it to a more light dominant area, and it has taken on that bigger leaf growth pattern now, and it is growing quite a lot more significantly since I did that. So with the potting mix, you're fine to just use a standard decent quality potting soil and add a little bit of peat moss in there. If you don't have peat moss or you're not sure where you can find peat moss, then you can add things like perlite to the mix as well. So a couple of handfuls of perlite in there just to make sure that it's got some aeration in the soil and it's got decent drainage, because you don't want to create a boggy sort of environment for the roots to live in. I don't know many plants that would be happy living in a boggy environment. So just make sure that it drains particularly well. It doesn't have to be, as you're dropping the water in, it's running out the bottom. There are some plants that require that, but the Monstera fortunately isn't one of those. So um, that's pretty much everything I'm gonna say about potting mix, because you can pretty much make up your own potting mix as you're going along, because as I mentioned, they're pretty tolerant to any kind of potting mix. So you can use what I've advised you, or you can actually go and create a potting mix of your own. You can have it very well draining. You can use things like orchid bark in your mix, you can use perlite in your mix, you can use peat moss in your mix, you can use a whole variety of different things. But I think what I've mentioned to you is adequate for this plant, and especially as a beginner, these are generally the things that you're going to be using anyway. So it saves you having to go out and buy extra things to add to that potting mix. Okay. All right, so I think we've talked generally quite enough about potting mix there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to watering. So what you want to do with the Monstera is generally you want to wait for the first 2 inches, top 2 inches of the soil to dry out before you actually water the plant again. Now, as with the potting mix, where watering is concerned, this is a very, very forgiving plant. So it's very drought tolerant, and if you do forget to water it, it's not going to really get any adverse effects, providing you don't leave it for months and months on end. But forgetting to water it over the period of, let's say, a month, it's not going to kill the plant. It's not going to damage it in any significant way at all. You can quite happily have you know that if you've forgotten to water the plant, it's still going to be quite happy anyway, because the thickness of the stems that it grows have stored so much moisture that when the moisture's gone from the actual soil itself, it will start using the moisture within the plant. And for a plant to actually take all the moisture out of the soil is going to take a week to you know anything up to 2 weeks. Now, I would suggest just keep an eye on it. If you're a regular waterer, then it should be watered a little bit every week. But like I mentioned, if you forget, don't be too disheartened by it. You know, your plant will survive and it will be absolutely fine. It is quite drought tolerant, as I mentioned earlier, so you needn't worry if you know you have forgotten. And as I mentioned, ideally, you know, this is a good plant for uh, beginner. So you know, if you're new to the hobby and you're just getting into the routine of how you're keeping your plants and the watering regimes and so on and so forth, this is an ideal plant to start with, because you can't really get much wrong with it. So when watering the plant itself, I would suggest to use filtered water, because coming from a rainforest environment, you can imagine that, you know, it's getting that the humidity is, the water is being provided by the humidity, and the rainforests, they have their own ecosystem, so they create their own rain and so on and so forth, and most of that is created through evaporation and the humidity within the rainforest. So you can imagine the water is, you know, very clean and very pure when it's raining down over the rainforest, and it's gathering its nutrients from, you know, the leaves that are decaying on the floor. So the actual water itself that is being watered to the plants is very pure. So I would suggest to use filtered water. I use filtered water on all of my plants. So when filtering your water, I would suggest leave your water for 24 hours after filtering it. That just gives it an opportunity to get to room temperature, because you don't want to water your plants with, you know, cold water or water that is, you know, vastly different to the temperature of the house that you're in, because it can send the plant into shock. Although, like I did mention, this is quite a forgiving plant, but do try and adopt that method as if you're keeping tropical plants as the majority of your plants for watering, because, you know, it should be just a general rule of thumb to use filtered and room temperature water. So as I mentioned earlier, leave your water for 24 hours. That allows it to get to room temperature, but it also allows it to get rid of any further contaminants that are in the water that the actual filter itself didn't manage to catch. Now, I don't know if that's more paranoia on my behalf, due to the fact that I think the water filters through a filter quite quickly. So I myself, my way of thinking that is, how can it possibly catch every impurity that that filter is supposed to catch within that short period of time? So I will leave the water out just to evaporate what might be left in the water, if it's able to get rid of it through evaporation. So, you know, feel free to continue that method. You know, I find it works very well for me. You know, since the time where I've been doing that, I've had no adverse effects where watering is concerned with my plant. So I think I've talked enough about watering there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to humidity. Now again, with this plant, it will thrive in almost any environment, but a little bit of humidity is going to make it feel right at home. You know, it's going to replicate its natural environment, and obviously the more you do that, the more the plant's going to thrive. But saying that, like I mentioned, it's not a necessity with this plant. So if you are a beginner and you are starting out with this as one of your first plants and you don't have a humidifier, don't panic. It's not essential for this plant. And also, other things you can do to raise humidity is misting your plant. Um, I mist my plants on a daily basis, so this is in amongst the plants that get misted every morning before I go to work. The reason I do that is to try and replicate the morning dew that occurs within the rainforest in the morning. So if you were actually in a rainforest in the early hours, all the leaves of the plants, they would actually be covered in a dew, like the morning dew you're going to get here in England or anywhere else where you're walking across some grass and you've got the little droplets of water on there. It's just trying to replicate that, and the best time to do it is early in the morning, so that by the time the midday sun is up, you know, most of that water is evaporated off of there, because the last thing you want, you know, in the heat of the day is for there to be water on the leaves, because, you know, the water droplets are going to act like magnifying glass and they're going to actually help to burn the leaves. So, you know, the earlier you do it, the more likely it is that that's going to evaporate by the time the sun gets to its peak in the sky. Now, you know, if you don't have a humidifier and you don't have a mister at home, and a mister can be a simple spray bottle, you know, in your mister and your humidifier. I use filtered water in both of those. I don't think, you know, you have to go to the extent of doing that in your humidifier, because it does have filters. But you know, I find that my humidifier stays cleaner for longer by using filtered water. When I wasn't using filtered water in my humidifier, it was getting, you know, gunky and mucky quite regularly. And since I thought it's probably better I use filtered water, I'm probably having to clean it once a month, if not once every 6 weeks now, where before I was cleaning it almost every week. So you know, it just makes it a little bit easier for myself to do that. But other ways you can raise the humidity in your plant if you don't have those things is a very cool trick I learned from watching one of Tropical Plant Addict's videos. Is you can get little seashells, to find the type that you find at the beach, and you can just lay them around the top of the pot. And when you're watering your plant, so for instance, if you're watering it on a weekly basis, those shells are going to collect little reservoirs of water, and that's going to create natural humidity around your plant. The other thing that you can do is the drip tray at the bottom of the plant. You can fill that with pebbles, and you can actually half fill that with water, so it will naturally evaporate around the plant as well. That's another good way to raise humidity. Other things you can do is you can group your plants closely together, and that will create a natural humid environment around the plants. And you could do things like keep little vessels of water in between, you know, your different plant pots that you've got, and that will also help with evaporating to create that natural humid environment. So I think I've talked enough about humidity there as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to move on to fertilization of the plant. So due to the size that this plant can get to, it does require a certain amount of nutrient, although it doesn't require much. At the moment, as I've mentioned, my plant is probably about 3 to 3.5 foot tall, and I'm giving it nutrient at a quarter dilution rate. What I mean by that is if it's telling you to use 10 mil per 1 litre of water, I'm using 2.5 mil per 1 litre of water, so that's a quarter dilution rate. And I'm doing that every month and a half to 2 months. I don't think that it needs more than that. It's you know, it's quite a happy plant with, you know, a low amount of nutrient. Last thing you want to do is build up excess nutrients in the soil and within the plant itself as well, because for it to be able to get rid of that is almost impossible. So less is better when using nutrient for a plant in any case. Okay, so that is one way of adding nutrient to your plant. Now the Monstera itself, I would suggest that due to its growth pattern, you're probably on a yearly basis going to need to repot it anyway. Although the plant does like to be root bound and it's not particularly fussed, just to keep a good growth pattern of the plant, you're going to want to repot it on average once a year, up until the point where you get to the pot size where you're happy that you don't want it to increase any further than that, as far as the amount of space that the pot is taking up. So obviously the bigger the pot size and the bigger the plant, the more frequently you're going to add that nutrient to the water. So instead of every 6 weeks to 2 months, you might start doing it every month to 6 weeks, and you know, so on and so forth. And the other thing that you can do if you're not using nutrients, like for instance, if you're new to the hobby and you're a bit afraid of using nutrients, the other thing that you can do is once a year you can take the top 2 inches of the soil away from the plant and replace that with new soil, and the nutrients within that soil will be enough to carry that plant through to the next year when you repot it into new soil again. So I think as far as fertilizing is concerned, I've given you as you know, much information as I think is relevant for you to keep this plant happy. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to cuttings. Now this plant itself, as I mentioned earlier, I've taken several cuttings off the plant just to keep it in the growth pattern that I want it in, and I've actually trimmed a few leaves off as well at the same time. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you actually where to take the cuttings from. So I'm just going to turn this plant to the side here. Now what you want to do is you want to look for the node on the plant. So where you've got your leaves growing out of the plant, so these two stems here have a leaf on the end of them. I don't know if my leaves have actually gone out of the video now, but this part right here at the bottom of this lump here is the node where you can see the aerial root coming out from. That area there is called the node. So what you want to do is you want to cut probably about an inch, even maybe a little bit more, so maybe about this sort of length, inch and a half underneath the node, and you can just snip that straight off at a 45-degree angle. A lot of people will tell you to cut at a 45-degree angle, although I generally, when I'm taking cuttings, I'll just start cutting around the plant, because usually when I'm taking cuttings, it's off a big plant with a hell of a lot of growth, and I'm on average taking 20 to 30 cuttings at a time off of that plant, although that hasn't been the case with my Monstera. But I generally will just snip, 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 snip all the way around, and I've had equal amount of success taking them at 45-degree angles as I have of just taking a straight cutting. Now, once you've propagated this plant, and as I mentioned, you want to look for the node. So the node is this place here where the two leaves are adjoining, the two stems are adjoining with the leaves attached on top, and the little bulk underneath that, you will find a little bulk where it bulges out on either side, right perpendicular to where this aerial root is growing. That's your node. What you want to do is you want to cut an inch to an inch and a half below that, and then what you can do is you can water propagate this plant, or you can actually stick it straight into the potting medium that you're using. Now these plants themselves, they're very, very easy when it comes to propagation. So you don't need to use rooting hormones or anything like that. They're very simple. As a beginner, you can take cuttings off of this, and I can pretty much guarantee you success, as long as you're taking that cutting and you're putting it straight into water or straight into the potting mix. Now myself, generally when I take any cuttings, I'll put them straight into the water, because I like to see the roots developing, and I like to gauge when it's a time to actually be ready to repot those plants. And to see the roots developing is an opportunity to make sure that everything is going correctly. So generally I sort of lean towards water propagation whenever I am propagating any of my plants. That way you get to make sure that the roots are healthy and everything before you're actually going to pot them up, because if you put them up in a pot and something starts rotting underneath the soil, you're not going to know until the actual plant itself has died. And in water propagation, you have lots of opportunity to save that plant if you're seeing something going wrong, because you're seeing it as it happens. So I think I've mentioned enough there about cuttings. Oh, I did forget to mention that on average, for roots to start developing, you're looking at about 2 to 3 weeks. And from 3 weeks onwards, once the roots have started developing, you're probably looking another week or so, up to 2 weeks before it's ready to go into the potting medium that you're going to put it in, if you choose to do water propagation. Now, as I was saying, I think I've talked enough there in enough detail about taking cuttings and propagating the plant. And what I'm going to do finally is I'm going to give a quick mention to toxicity. Now, whenever I'm doing a video about a plant and I know that the plant has a certain level of toxicity, I will mention it in the video, because I think it's very helpful and useful information, and I think it's the kind of information that should be included when you're considering this plant within your collection, because a lot of people will look at a plant in the shop and think, oh, that's lovely, I'm just going to take that plant home, and we don't take into account enough when a plant actually has a level of toxicity, how it might affect the people who live in our home or the animals that we live with. So the Monstera Deliciosa is mildly toxic. I don't know why that isn't rolling off my tongue so easily today. I think I've messed that up 2 or 3 times now. Please forgive me. But yeah, the toxicity of this plant is very mild. So it's toxic to people and pets. So typically ingestion of this plant will cause mouth and stomach irritation and possible vomiting. Now, as with any toxic plant, if you notice either particularly children or your pets, have all of a sudden become ill, or they've become irritated by something, and you do have toxic plants in your house, you know, do go and check your plants. You know, you want to be able to take that out of the equation, just to keep yourself, keep your mind at ease, to know that that isn't the cause of it. And if it is, then you know that obviously you'll need to speak to a doctor about that, or possibly take whatever that is to either the vet or the hospital to get them checked out, and you've got the information that you need to give them as well. Although it's very unlikely that, you know, a kid is going to start ingesting your plant. You know, I would find that to be a very rare thing to happen, but unfortunately cats and dogs, they do like to have a nibble, the odd nibble on green things. Cats, dogs, birds, you know, all kinds of pets. So just keep in mind that this is toxic to, you know, both humans and your pets at home. Okay, I think I'm going to pretty much end the video there. The reason I did this video today was due to my votes on Instagram. Now, for those of you who are not aware, or you're new to my channel today, I have an Instagram account which is also called Plants and Paints, so plants underscore and underscore paints. And generally what I do is every week to maybe week and a bit, I will put up a vote on Instagram with a few different plants, and I will ask people what plant they would like to learn about during this video, and people will vote for which plant it is. Now, I can't remember off of my head what I'd actually put up. I put up the Monstera Deliciosa, I put up the Caladium White Christmas and Red Flash, and there was another one that I put up. It was one of my peperomias, the Sienna Sunset, and the Monstera Deliciosa won by a huge margin, so hence the reason I'm here today doing this video. For those of you who've tuned in due to voting for this and have been waiting for the video, I hope you've enjoyed my video today. And for those of you who are new joining me here today, or just watching the video in general, same to you. I hope you've really enjoyed my video today. If there's anything that I've missed out and there's more information that you want to know about the Monstera plant, please don't hesitate to put it in the comments below. If you've enjoyed my video today, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon to get notifications of future content that I'm due to release. As I mentioned, I generally try to release a video every week to every week and a bit. As I was saying, I hope you enjoyed my video today. I look forward to making lots more content for you to enjoy. My name's Zahir, this is Plants and Paints, and I'll see you again soon. Take care, bye bye.